So, welcome everybody to this Trees and Design Action Group seminar. This is our last for this year on the theme of resilience, and today it's Resilience through BNG, What Have We Learned in England, a 2-year review. The number of people who registered for this, over 500, shows us all that this is obviously a tremendous topic at the moment. So just to remind everybody, Trees and Design Action Group is a network and a forum that brings people and organisations together to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in the planning, design, construction, management and maintenance of our urban places. And evidence-based information is really important to us, hence the presentations today. And so is knowledge exchange and cross-sector working and so on. So this is where you, the audience, we really do encourage your questions, participation in this effort. So we must thank our partners for this event, the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, the Institute of Chartered Foresters, the Landscape Institute, and the Town and Country Planning Association. And we're very pleased that our chair for today is Tracy Whitfield, who's Technical and Research Manager at the Landscape Institute, where she works with members and partners to develop high-quality resources, including technical guidance, tools, training materials, research outputs, and briefing papers. And her work focuses on advancing environmental objectives, strengthening professional technical skills across the landscape sector, and fostering wider industry collaboration. And through this, she helps position the Landscape Institute as a leading authority within the landscape profession. So a very appropriate chair for this particular topic. So over to you, Tracy.
Great, thanks, Sue, and thanks, Dee. So hello from me. The Landscape Institute, I'll tell you a little bit about us. We're the UK's chartered body for landscape professionals, championing landscape and nature and all the benefits that they bring in both rural and urban places. We provide training, webinars, workshops, and an academy, and we work with colleges and universities on accredited courses. We have a wide range of specialist members, from landscape architects to urban designers, planners, ecologists, engineers, historians, garden and plant experts, and they work in a variety of settings, from small-scale pocket parks to big public spaces, heritage sites, and large-scale infrastructure. Our members help our efforts to shape policy, create tools, guidance and standards to promote the highest quality in the landscape profession. And we like to partner with professionals. Collaboration, we feel, is key to the success of improving outcomes as well. So which is why this seminar is really important to us, where we have the opportunity to hear from speakers from a mix of backgrounds. And I'm really looking forward. I've had a sneak peek at what they're presenting, so I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about what they've got to say as well. And the LI has supported efforts in introducing methods to enhance nature and biodiversity. And we feel that every site has the potential to contribute to BNG and improve the UK's already depleted natural and ecological systems. BNG also supports well-being, social and economic benefits, essential factors that make up a huge difference in people's lives. We acknowledge that there have been challenges along the way, but these can be overcome, and these spaces are vital in the habitat linkage and contribute to other issues such as climate change, flooding, carbon mitigation, and they need time to bed in and be adapted and develop. It's been heartening to see the developers, growers and contractors who have already committed to increasing biodiversity and the investment and jobs it's created along the way. And we'll start today by hearing from Nick White, who's Principal Advisor, Net Gain Natural England, who will talk about why did we want it, what hasn't it delivered, and what have we learned, and what is the future. So over to Nick.
Thanks ever so much, Tracy, and good afternoon, everyone. And I hope people are safely ensconced away from the storm as well. But as Tracy said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why we were looking to introduce Biodiversity Net Gain, what was intended from it, and kind of what's it's achieved so far, and then touch a little bit about what may be to come as well. But And as Tracy said, my name's Nick. I work for Natural England's government advisors on the natural environment, and I've had the pleasure of being engaged with what's become known as Biodiversity Net Gain for the best part of about 8 years now. So I've seen it in various stages. I wanted to kick off, and this may be quite familiar to some people, but I wanted to kick off by talking about the world before we had biodiversity net gain. So I was working on aspects of green infrastructure, working obviously for NE, interested in looking to efforts to recover nature in this country. And the picture was a very poor one, and sadly that's continued to be, in that the United Kingdom is well known, is one of the most nature depleted countries in Europe, if not the wider world. And there was a really polarized debate around nature versus development as well. Sadly, that seems to be coming back to an extent, but there was very much a tendency for communities who may or may not have had good reasons to be opposed to a particular development, to use nature as a reason for kind of challenging that development. Sometimes that was fair, sometimes it wasn't. And also development itself would often be kind of citing nature as a kind of challenge for the development process. And we had a very highly contested, very subjective planning space where arguably most of the power was on the side of the developments who had the money to kind of pay for lawyers, etc. And you'd have nice images being presented of this is what a scheme in the future is going to look like. And developers ecologists describing the kind of the positive benefits to nature that the scheme would be providing. At the same time, you'd have potentially local government ecologists, if there was one, sometimes challenging that on the kind of same ecological grounds, but not having the kind of same kind of power as potentially the developer has. And there being no single consistent way of either party being able to accurately and consistently describe what they're talking about. So you had a very kind of subjective view over kind of whether something was going to be positive or not. And communities kind of trapped in the middle somewhere, wondering whether this was actually going to deliver a benefit of outcome or not. So it was a very contested and often subjective space as well, and lots of toing and froing and arguing over whether something was beneficial or not. We also sadly live in a country where equality in terms of access to green space is not great. COVID brought that home to all of us. Some people are very well served in terms of having blue and green spaces close to where they live. Others, typically the poorer communities, people in communities, typically don't. And so you had that kind of disparity as well. A lot of focus on nature had been on kind of protected sites and kind of local nature reserves. Professor John Lawton earlier in the decade had highlighted the fact that we need to move away from focusing on sites, be thinking more in terms of bigger, better, more joined up spaces if we want to give nature a chance to recover. But there really wasn't that kind of connectivity in place. There wasn't that kind of join up between sites. And all of this set in the context of a broadly declining state of public expenditure on nature recovery, kind of post the financial crash. Most of the investment was going in through the public purse, but that was declining and limited private investment. I painted quite a bleak picture. There were exceptions to that, but I think as a generalization of the kind of way that nature featured within planning, that was all too true. And particularly as well, that if you had an application that wasn't dealing with the protected site or protected species, that anything on that development site was essentially fair game. There was no real protection for it within the planning system. Equally, in terms of actual how was the environment and nature thought of in the context of integrating it into development, typically it wasn't. Often would be the case where a scheme would be at quite an advanced stage of design, just going to be submitted when the kind of realization would land that we need to put some greenery into this to try and help it get through planning. A scheme would be passed to an ecologist who's essentially got a fully worked up design, no real space to influence it in any meaningful way other than just around the edges. Whatever nature then got integrated into a scheme, all too often once the scheme had got planning permission would then be a kind of value engineered back out by QS on a kind of cost reduction exercise. And if things were able to kind of survive that exercise and see it through to actually being delivered, then very rarely would people be thinking about the ongoing management and maintenance, particularly not long-term management and maintenance. And all too often then you'd see quite poorly poor bits of green infrastructure that no one was really had thought about how's this going to be managed and maintained, possibly not even accessible for equipment, and just a kind of bad outcome all round, a lot of kind of waste of time for the development in terms of not a good outcome that they've been able to introduce into it, and not a good outcome for nature as well. There were exceptions to all of this, but again, typically nature was an afterthought within the development process as opposed to being something thought of early on. And there was very little join up as well between the different professions involved in it. So that's the context that BNG was coming through into, and looking to address some of those. But although it's, as a policy, talks about biodiversity, the name is on the tin, the mandatory biodiversity net gain, it was actually, as Tracy's already alluded to, looking to deliver slightly wider benefits than nature alone. Nature clearly was a really integral part of what the policy is trying to do. It's trying, firstly, to kind of reinforce the mitigation hierarchy by valuing habitats, and in a way that previously we really hadn't. As I said, unless in the past something was a protected site or protected species, it got no real protection at all within planning. But by having an approach that kind of measures and values what's there in a site, it helps to then try and provide some protection to that. It's in no one's interest to really lose that habitat if they can avoid it. Secondly, it's also trying to contribute towards local nature recovery as well, recognizing that there's opportunities to get a bigger bang for a buck by joining spaces up, allowing that kind of species to move across a landscape, contribute to kind of local green infrastructure strategies and local nature recovery strategies, etc. So looking to help to provide that connectivity. But people are really important. We live in a small, crowded island. If we want people to be concerned about the state of nature, we need to bring them with us. And clearly, nature can play a really important role in terms of benefiting people's lives as well, in terms of health and well-being, helping to create more resilient kind of communities, more resilient infrastructure, etc., particularly in the space of the context of a changing climate. So looking to provide benefits to people, and particularly close to where people live and work. And then lastly, looking to try and improve the process for developments themselves. So I introduce a more objective way of demonstrating that development is sustainable, it's delivering positive outcomes for nature. So have a kind of a consistent and objective way of trying to measure that. And in doing that, trying to then de-risk the development process. Because often one of the biggest challenges for development was the risk that potentially objections on nature grounds presented to them. And as I said, although some of those were genuine, many weren't as well. So the idea being that actually this would be BNG would be a way of evidencing the positives that the development could provide from a nature perspective to local communities. So that's what the policy was looking to try and do. So where have we got to? Well, the policy has only been, or the law rather, because this is a legal requirement, has only been in place since early 2024. So it's really too early at this stage to point definitively to, oh, these are the ecological outcomes that have been delivered. It's going to take a while for those to become apparent and come through. But we can already see some quite significant, and I would argue dramatic shifts in the way that nature is thought about through the development process. And that's leading to a kind of broader paradigm shift that's particularly true within the bigger developments. I think it's still still hasn't kind of trickled down, if you like, to some of the SME size schemes. But we're seeing from ecologists, from landscape architects, from other professions, a real sense that there's much greater collaboration taking place. Ecologists are being brought in earlier to think about schemes, particularly at site selection, outline design stage now as well. So people are actively looking at what's on a site before they acquire it, with a view to how easy is it going to be or not for them to achieve biodiversity net gain on that site. And a growing realization, rather, that the more that you can retain what's on that site, if you can do so realistically and look to improve that, that's a much better route to achieving biodiversity net gain in the most cost-effective way than simply clearing a site of all kind of nature that was there previously and then looking to reintroduce it afterwards. So if you can work with what's there, and people are increasingly looking to doing that, and that in itself is helping to reinforce the mitigation hierarchy as well. So it's providing a value to what's there and discouraging the destruction of that and encouraging its enhancement. As I said, it's also creating much more of a kind of team ethos as well, bringing different professions together. Solutions to BNG aren't just with the ecologist. It does need people working with landscape architects, engineers, architects, etc., to co-design, co-create places. And bringing contractors into that process as well. I think that's starting to increasingly be recognised that this is biodiversity net gain requires this 30-year management and maintenance with it. And all too often, how sites get managed for the long term hasn't been thought about. And so schemes get designed or have been designed, which on paper ecologically may look okay, but in practice just won't work because of the context of the site or even just some of the ecology involved. So bringing in those who've got skills and knowledge about how to manage and maintain sites, how to communicate with local stakeholders early into that process as well is going to be key. And we're starting to see that happen now as well with contractors brought in, and some instances as well of contractors actually refusing to take on sites where they think actually the outcome is undeliverable. And although no one wants to see that happen, I think the fact that it is actually quite a positive thing. People are thinking about this quite sensibly and seriously and saying, actually, is this design achievable and deliverable as well? So it's leading to a slow but quite dramatic change in terms of the way people are thinking about nature in the context of their development. It's also created an entirely new asset class from scratch, which is this idea that actually through developers who can't do net gain on site, and there will be many valid reasons why that may not be sensible, ecologically or practical, and they're then needing to go off site, it's creating a whole new raft of investment, a whole new asset class of money going into nature recovery as well. So when Biodiversity Net Gain first started, there were no nationally registered offsites locations, and anyone going offsite has to have that site registered. At the time of speaking, i.e. today, we are up to 156 registered sites. There's over another 50 in the process of being onboarded as well. So that figure will soon be in the north of 200 mark. And that's with 5,200 hectares now of land that's been registered, set aside for nature recovery through BNG as well. That's providing a broad range of habitats. So yes, there's the more common ones, such as other neutral grasslands, but also, and encouragingly, some of the more kind of niche habitats, if you like. So things like open mosaic habitat, intertidal habitat, watercourses, woodland. From which they can now recognize they can actually get a return from nature. That includes developers themselves, so some house builders are creating these sites, people such as airports and other infrastructure owners, as well as local planning authorities as well. So you've got a kind of growing diversity of landowners providing net gains for developers as well. It's also led to a whole range of other kind of spin-off benefits. So we've got an entirely new kind of legal mechanism being quite widely used now in the form of conservation covenants. That was in the Environment Act. It's not linked directly to biodiversity net gain, but it's providing a legal mechanism and quite a flexible legal mechanism to secure land for the purposes of BNG. You've got Section 106 is being used in a way that up until the onset of BNG, a lot of local authority legal departments didn't even realise was possible, which is that you can use a Section 106 to secure land that's not directly connected to a development. Insurance products are coming through. You've got BNG specific insurance products starting to emerge now to address not just the ecological risks, but also some of the financial and contractor failure risks associated with biodiversity net gain. BNG has given a real kind of spur to new technologies, particularly around the use of artificial intelligence combined with kind of satellite and drone imagery to give you indicative baseline assessments, but also to help with longer term monitoring. But then things like eDNA and acoustics as well coming into play. Kind of existing technologies in the form of, if you're not a fan of spreadsheets, then BNG perhaps isn't the one for you. But it's being kind of very widely used, and I'll come back to the kind of spreadsheet that informs the net gain calculation tool. Tracy made the point as well about the kind of growing employment that's coming off this. So we've got upskilled contractors, we've got a new kind of class of people working as BNG specialists, both in the ecology field, but also in finance, in law, working on, as maintenance contractors, working within the kind of horticultural sector and the trade sector, providing kind of things for sites. So there's a whole new kind of range of employment and investment coming through off the back of BNG. And then you've got significant venture capital investment coming in as well. So this is money coming into providers of habitat banks or kind of associated industries to help invest in nature recovery. And we estimate that's somewhere in the region of about half £500 million that's been invested currently through that process. So BNG, when it was implemented, it wasn't straightforward. It's fair to say it's a new requirement that's interacting with an existing and quite complex planning system. So there were, kind of as to be expected, kind of initial challenges. Partly that was a result of the fact that the kind of legislation, in terms of the secondary legislation, came through quite late. So planners didn't have the detail early on as to kind of what the legal requirements would be, which led to kind of variable understanding, levels of understanding rather, between planners of different professions, developers, as to what the law actually was. In the early days, there was a lot of concern about exploitation of exemptions. Some projects are exempt from BNG, and there was a concern that they were being overused. Again, in the early days, there weren't many sites registered and available for use. So there were genuine concerns about actually how available was off-site land in terms of supply. And there were some gaps. And the projects that had to deal with all of this earliest were the small developments. They were the ones that were going through planning the fastest. And so they were the ones that were encountering BNG first, and arguably were least prepared, if you like, to deal with it compared to some of the bigger developments. But things have moved on. There's much greater knowledge and understanding now of BNG. There are useful templates out there to bring down legal costs, such Section 106 templates, conservation covenant templates. There's greater knowledge and awareness amongst planning authorities about the legislation and its approach. There are still pockets of variability, let's say, but generally things have got better. There's also much greater realism in terms of BNG proposals than perhaps was the case in the outset. And we're seeing now a large number of allocations having been made. So there's now just under 1,000 allocations have been made off-site. So that's still only 6% of the land that's available off-site. So there's still a lot of unallocated land. And specifically for this audience, there's a lot of land coming forward now, looking at providing woodlands and kind of tree cover benefits as well. So over 570 hectares of woodlands proposed for BNG. 140 hectares of orchards, and then 21 hectares just of trees as well, and they're in kind of relatively high demand when it comes to BNG. And the exemptions have kind of settled down as well. They're at a fairly steady rate. I think there's a better understanding. But clearly there have been concerns around still how is BNG going to operate for SMEs and some of their experiences with it. And so there were the two kind of consultations earlier this year, back in July, one on minor, medium and brownfield sites and a second one on NSIPs. We are still waiting for government's response to those consultations, so hopefully they'll be coming through shortly. They both were responded to very well in terms of a high volume of responses. Clearly a lot of interest in this. So we watch this space in terms of what might be coming through as a consequence of those consultations, but we are still expecting NSIPs to come into force from a mandatory perspective for BNG in May of next year. And just finally, it's quite easy to think of BNG very much through in what's going on in England lens. I mean, there's enough happening here to keep everyone quite busy. But what sometimes isn't appreciated is quite how influential this policy and approach is being internationally as well. So the metric that was developed in England has truly gone global. There are versions of it being used on every continent. There is actually a global version of it. And so projects around the world are using it. Policy-wise, there's a lot of interest from different jurisdictions, both in Europe, but also in places like China, Indonesia, and elsewhere. The British standard, the voluntary standard for net gain that was developed in England, is now being extended and incorporated into an international standard. And the policy itself is cited by the World Economic Forum as being one of the top 10 finance models for nature recovery globally as well. So it has had quite a lot of impact. But that's it from me. I shall hand back to Tracy.
Great, thanks, Nick. Covered an awful lot there in that 20 minutes that we got. So fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll ask Sue to help in a minute, but there was somebody who asked a question earlier on. We've got about 5 minutes or so to be able to ask some immediate questions to Nick. And then later on, we'll have all the speakers back up again and we'll be able to ask some awesome questions. But Alex Fenton, are you happy to put your hand up and turn your camera on and ask Nick your question regarding credits that you asked earlier on? Alex, can you hear us at all?
I think you're on mute. Should we just ask the question?
Yeah. So just to ask, he said, are there any proportionate figures for how much developers are delivering BNG on-site, off-site, or buying credits?
So it's a really good question. When the policy was first being developed, the DEFRA commissioned an impact assessment and a market analysis trying to work out what that split might look like. At the time, figures ranged from an assumption of between about 60 to about 80% on site. It depended on quite how the assumptions you made, with the residual being delivered off site. And the ambition was that as few projects as possible would need to go to statutory credits because they are the most expensive option, but they're needed as a last resort in case things get stuck. I mentioned that so far we've had just under 1,000 allocations. Compare that with the number of statutory credit sales that have been made, which is just over 20. I think it's about 25. So people aren't buying statutory biodiversity credits, particularly, which is good. It suggests that the market is working. The actual split of on-site, off-site currently looks roughly proportionate, but the only thing I would caveat that with is that it takes quite a while for developments to get through planning, generally anyway. And so there's still a lot of schemes that will have started when BNG first came in that haven't yet got to the point of actually needing to demonstrate how they're going to deliver biodiversity gain. So the figures at the moment are reflective more typically of small developments that are getting through quite quickly. So that balance may alter a little bit over time. I wouldn't expect it to significantly. I think probably still somewhere in the region of about 75% is being done on site with the rest off site.
Can I add an addition to that question, actually, a question from me? Are you seeing any sort of collection? Are they sort of grouped up in sort of close to urban areas, or, are there those within urban sites going out of counties and, quite a distance sometimes?
It will depend very much on it fundamentally really depends on the baseline value of the development site itself. So most brownfield sites, not all, because open mosaic habitat is an exemption, but most brownfield sites have a low biodiversity value. And so typically people will find it easier to deliver gains within the red line of that. Also for some sites which were previously kind of low-grade agricultural land or something like that, again, it might be easier to achieve net gain fully within the development site. Ones, however, where people are having to go off-site can be driven by if your site's really small and constrained, you may have limited opportunity to actually deliver gains on site. Or equally, if you're developing on land that is already of high biodiversity value, you'll likely have to go off site for an element of it. So it does vary a little bit. Urban sites, typically, unless they've got open mosaic habitat, yes, they're more likely to be achieving gains on site. But there can be instances as well where they're having to go off site, and equally rural areas are sometimes on and sometimes off. So it varies. Tracy, I'm afraid, depends fundamentally on the quality of the baseline.
Okay, great. Alex Fenton again, sorry, I noticed you came off mute earlier on. Are you able to unmute now with your second question? Because that was an interesting one too. Okay, looks like he's not able to. So I'll just ask that one, and then Sue, if you could see who else might like to pop up. So he was asking, a nature restoration fund was mentioned in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill earlier this year. I vaguely recall that that it wouldn't stand on the toes of BNG, but is there any clear guidance on how? Sorry, it's just covered over. Bear with me a second. On how the NRF will function, and in particular how it will work alongside BNG. E.g., will developers have to do both?
So Alex is right. The Biodiversity Net Gain is separate to the nature restoration funds, which are part of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. So nature restoration funds are very much there and for delivering or dealing with things that you're having to mitigate impacts on, so protected species or nutrients or things like that. There will be area specific, and they'll be specific to kind of particular outcomes that you're having to do. Whereas BNG is a legal requirement that applies to your project unless you're actually exempt from it. So there are two distinct requirements, if you like, or approaches, and by doing the BNG, you may still have to be doing NRF for if you've got, for example, great crested newts on your site, or if you're having to deal with nutrient mitigation as well. We are looking to do some work to see how you can potentially combine the outcomes of both together, so they can contribute overall towards your BNG. That's work in process, but essentially they're two different schemes, two separate schemes.
Okay, great, thanks. Sue, did you see somebody you'd like to?
Yeah, so looking at my big screen, sorry, sideways. Gavin Robbie, are you there? Because you made actually an interesting comment, which actually reflects to a lot of comments made today, and also in other forums that I've been trying to work with, like BS 5837 review, which is the way in which trees are assessed that aren't necessarily retaining the trees of the best biodiverse value. So is Gavin, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't have a working camera at the moment, so it was quite lucky for everyone. My point was just that is in relation to B&D being kind of a tree work related thing. I mean, we're a arboricultural consultancy, and we've found on a number of cases it's very difficult to give sound arboricultural advice. Just because BNG, kind of effectively overrides it, and we've had a number of instances where we can't provide suitable mitigation for tree loss because a section of brambles in the corner of the site is deemed to be of greater value than any tree planting. There's been poor tree retention decisions because they can't afford to remove trees that are in quite poor condition or will be too close to buildings. There's been quite a few of these different issues. It seems to be the kind of BNG and sound arboricultural advice can work against each other, to a certain extent. And as I say, it's normally the BNG advice which gets taken because obviously it's got the sort of the legal backing.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing BNG has done is it's caused people to pay far more attention to trees than previously they potentially were as well, because as you said, they all now have a value in terms of within your baseline as well. So the days of just not considering them and felling and clearing and there being no consequences of that are not there anymore. But obviously, we do still need to be thinking about the kind of wider issues around tree health, etc. And I talked about the desire or the move of different professions, working more collaboratively. I would hope that your experience so far, Gavin, is more reflective of just a new policy that's kind of coming in and people are getting used to it, rather than necessarily something that's indicative of a kind of long-term kind of conflict between the kind of that aspect. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, let's hope. Yeah, it's just a sort of a initial kind of knee-jerk reaction almost to sort of seeing spreadsheets and just thinking coming to these decisions, and hopefully it'll smooth out over time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gavin, for your question, and Nick for your answer there. And thank you, Nick, for the presentation. We're going to move on now to Andy Hirams, Director of the Urban Plant Lab and Senior Lecturer in Arboricultural at University Centre, Myerscough, and co-author with Henrik Homan of the TDAG Tree Species Guide, who will talk about what do we know about tree species and their biodiversity value. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks very much, Tracy. That was really interesting to get that context as well. I'm going to shift the dial a little bit. We're still going to be talking on biodiversity, but in my case, I want to talk about how we might begin to determine the biodiversity value for individual urban trees. Before I move on, I just want to check, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, all good. Thanks, Andy.
Great. Thank you. I suppose that in terms of context for my presentation, myself and Henrik were involved with and led a project that delivered a species selection for green infrastructure. For those of you that don't know, it's a free guidance on tree species selection that's available through TDAG. It was published by TDAG. And actually, very early on in that process, we were getting questions around, can we have information on biodiversity value of individual tree species? And this was actually a long time before BNG really came to prominence. But at the time, we felt that it was too complex a question to answer, really. And it probably still is, frankly. But it's always been in the back of our mind as to how we can give advice and guidance on the biodiversity value at the species level of trees. And just, to give you an indication, this is the guidance. There's about 280 odd species profiles within that guidance, and as well as a number of chapters geared around how we can select trees for urban environments and how we can select trees to maximize ecosystem service value, for example. So the Woodland Trust then came along a few years ago and enabled a pilot project that really helped us to tackle this question head on. So, what do we know about the individual biodiversity value of trees, and how can we, if you like, develop a metric that actually enables people in charge of plant palettes to make decisions around a palette of trees that might deliver greater biodiversity value than a subsequent palette of trees. And so we had really just a few criteria that I felt were really important. One is that this had to be data-led. We had to have meaningful in terms of biodiversity value or tree resilience, the criteria for inclusion. They needed to be agnostic to geographic origin. So in other words, non-native trees were treated fairly, and often that's probably not the case. Represented these metrics should be represented on a 4-point scale in some way, and confidently applied to the majority of species in the TDAG guide. And taken in concert, the criteria should capture the relative biodiversity value in a broad sense, and not just be limited to sort of trees that have value to pollinators, for example. And so this initial pilot work, we looked at 4 case study genre to really try and explore whether we could develop a metric. And so we looked at the maple group, Acer, the cherries, Prunus, oaks, Quercus, and the limes, Tilia. And that actually comprised of 66 species that we did this earlier evaluation for. Before I move on, I just thought I'd share a quote from a book I read recently. And I think it captures something that's important to remember when we're talking about nativeness. It says, there is no such thing as a fixed idea for an environment, no reef onto which nostalgia can anchor. The human imposition of borders on the world inevitably changes our perception of what belongs where. But to look into deep time is to see only an ever-changing list of inhabitants of one ecosystem or another. That's not to say that native species do not exist, only that the concept of native we so easily tie to a sense of place also applies to time. And I think that's a kind of important concept to think about as we plan for future environments and we look to bring broad palettes of species that can deliver for our ecosystems. So our approach then was to, if you like, take a number of different categories. So the coevolution of a species to our region, particular tree features, evidence of good insect host relationships, and the resilience of the species to a future scenario. And then within those categories, we had additional criteria that we looked at. So, for example, what we called phylogenetic relatedness. Tree features included the size, the flowering, the fruiting. We looked at various databases of insects and food plants, and then looked at attributes that might confer resilience. And then each of those elements was classified and given a categorical scoring system of 1 to 4. And then we took a mean score of all those 10 criteria and then provided a relative biodiversity value as an outcome statement. So just to give you a bit more of an example and unpack some of those things a little bit more, we looked at the phylogenetic relatedness of species. And so 4 would represent either a native or a very close sibling relationship with a UK native species. And 1 would represent, if you like, the most distant phylogenetic species. So you've got the native species scoring much more highly than distantly related non-native species. And there's some good examples of these sort of phylogenetic analysis that we can use, for example, in oaks. Another thing we looked at is tree size, and thankfully within the species selection guidance that we put together for TDAG, we'd already looked at tree size and got 4 categories of tree size, and there's no getting around it. Tree size does matter for all ecosystem service provision, and large healthy trees will deliver often much greater benefits from a biodiversity point of view as well. We looked at additional features. Those included things like deeply fissured bark. We know that that's good for microarthropods. Features such as ectofloral nectaries, leaf domatia, little hairy regions in the where leaf veins meet. They can be good for mites, for example. We looked at databases that would suggest that a species was dual mycorrhizal, so they had the ability to associate with ecto and endomycorrhizae, other nitrogen fixing associations of the root systems. Again, there's some good databases around that. And so we had these additional features up to a maximum of 4 traits. We looked at the flowering ability and whether the floral resources were good or bad, effectively. So if a species was just wind pollinated, we had awarded that at 1 point. If it was insect pollinated in a sort of dominant flowering period, it was 2. High floral resources, nectar and pollen during the peak period was 3, and then off-peak high floral resources scored 4. So if we looked at the TDAG database that we already had, you can see that most of the flowering occurs in late spring, and far fewer species actually flowered in late summer or early autumn or late winter, for example. And so if the flowering was in that time of year, then we awarded it more than if it was flowering in late spring when there's already quite a high floral resource. Fruiting, we looked at trees that were sterile, only scored 1 point up, and then different levels of, if you like, animal engagement using dispersal categories that were defined in the academic paper. So animacory, wind dispersed seeds only scored 2. Trees with high fruiting resources that have animal dispersal, diazoturi, scored 3, and then trees with fruit that is animal dispersed, endozoochuri, actually consumed by the animal, then that they scored 4. Then we looked, as I say, we looked at a lot of insect host databases, and then we used a cluster analysis to say, well, in relative terms, does this species have a high level of plant parasites or aphids or whatever the database yielded, or a relatively low level? And so you can see there in the right-hand images, the species that we looked at varied very, very widely in terms of the species of insect that associated with them. And that's documented in the literature. We then did some work around the resilience of trees, because we felt that if we're trying to secure resilience and biodiversity value for the future, then the species ought to be resilient, and that ought to be taken into account. And so we used a combination of plant traits and species distribution modeling. I just share an image there on the right-hand side of some work that Kev Martin and I did for a recent project around the future suitability of London's trees. And we see that for each one of those dots on the plots, it represents a known distribution of that species. And you can see how, for example, London over the next 50, 60 years is drifting into a climate space where it's going to be very unsuitable for Betula pendula, for example. Whereas another species, actually, London is drifting more into its comfort zone. That's holm oak. So so that's an important element of securing biodiversity for future climates. And so again, we had a 4-point relative scale from sensitive to future climate through to resilient to future climate. And so then overall, we were able to combine all of those different elements, so quite a large competence scoring system. And then for the 66 species, we were able to separate them into things that we believe to be of very high biodiversity value through to those species that were low biodiversity value. And we presented that outcome statement, very high, high, moderate, and low, with a confidence outcome as well, to give readers indications around whether or not we had really good quality data behind that statement, or whether actually we're just making our best assessment, but we would value additional data to really give it a very robust and a high confidence in the outcome. And so you can see there that we were confident, for example, in Prunus avium, Prunus pardus, Quercus roba being a very high biodiversity value. And then if we look down at the other end of the spectrum, lots of the species, so for example, in this case, some of the non-native maples scored rather low in the order of things. And that was actually presented at a conference about a year ago, and towards a biodiversity metric for urban trees. Myself, Harry Watkins at St Andrews Botanic Gardens, and Kev Martin from Royal Botanic Gardens Kew were part of that effort. So in terms of the next steps then, I'm really pleased to say that Barrett Redrow have come up with some funding to look at the remaining species in the Trees and Design Action Group guidance, and so that we take this from the pilot stage through to a much larger analysis that will hopefully cover most of what's in the TDAG guide as it stands. And I'm really pleased to say that Eloise Fenton, who has recently completed her master's with the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, is going to be helping to corral databases and getting her insights from her research into this final iteration. And so that help is really greatly appreciated. But we're also looking for engagement from other professionals that want to contribute to this effort, trying to recognize species variation in biodiversity value and how we can bring the best quality information we can to practitioners and professionals in this area. So the next steps then will be to do that analysis, and then we hope to effectively embed this biodiversity value icon within the existing TDAG guidance. And if you're familiar with that, you'll see we've just going to pop it above the pictures there, and so that you have a simple outcome statement and a confidence score around a species. So that's the aim. That's what we hope to do, and we hope to do that in relatively short order. Okay, well, in other news, and sort of allied to this, is that we have just literally published a week ago the Future Climate Suitability of London's Public Realm Trees. If you're interested in that, please do scan the QR code. Of course, it's an allied project in the sense that, unless we're able to secure resilient canopy cover, unless we're able to plant suitable trees into our urban environments, then we're not going to achieve the biodiversity value that our landscapes would otherwise achieve. So that's an important sort of part of the puzzle, I suppose. And I just wanted to try and raise awareness of that. But that's all I've got to say. I'm excited that we have an opportunity to talk about this and engage with this more generally. And I'm really looking forward to what the other speakers have to say. So thank you, Tracy. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andy. And yeah, fascinating, all of that, and got lots of thumbs ups there and claps. So everybody's obviously very interested in it. We've got 5 minutes just for some urgent questions, and as I said, we can ask questions again later on. But Mike Batley had an interesting question. I wonder, Mike, are you happy to turn your camera and mic on and ask Andy direct your question?
Yes, Andrew,
Great.
You've got me. Thank you. Yeah, hi, Andrew. Terrific bit of work. I mean, don't let me say anything other than that in the first instance. But I think my concern, or at least I'd be interested to know how much you've contextualized this in terms of where it should be applied in terms of place. In terms of street trees in urban areas, the criteria that you would use to judge which tree may be more appropriate could be quite different to biodiversity as your sort of critical consideration. You're looking at things like tree form, size. It may not be the largest tree that's the most appropriate. For instance, looking at resistance to pollutants, etc. Fruiting is a very contentious issue as well. So yeah, I was just really interested to know how that could be built in, or whether actually you do consider place in terms of how it should be applied. Yeah,
I mean, thanks. It's a good question, and it's the problem with this whole project is that it's fiendishly complex, and I think from my point of view, I mean, there's a couple of things to state. What we would intend to do is to publish any guidance in tandem with probably the first steps guide in biodiversity within the TDAG sort of family, and then that will help put this into context, because of course clearly just selecting a species isn't going to be adequate. You do need to think about how that planting links to adjacent landscapes, whether or not it's competing against other ecosystem services that you might want to have, or indeed ecosystem disservices that you might want to acknowledge. And I think when it comes to selecting urban trees, really biodiversity value may be only one element of what those sort of criteria are for selection. And you mentioned a few, fruiting can be a conflict with paved infrastructure, but might be quite acceptable in other contexts. You might have size constraints, so all those normal constraints should be acknowledged. But hopefully we can then begin. We can, if we have this biodiversity information, we can add that tier, if you like, that filter to suitable species. And then if you're sort of whittling down your species that might be suitable, and there might be 5 or 6 species, you can then add nuance from a biodiversity perspective. But it is a really complicated process, and we're just hoping to, just add value and add insight and add some sort of evidence behind where species sit. Because one of the challenges I see, bringing it back to the discussion on biodiversity net gain, one of the challenges I see is that there's not enough nuance provided for the type of tree, and it's just tree area rather than tree area plus the type of tree that has a really important impact on what the biodiversity value of that particular tree is going to be. So that might be my misunderstanding of biodiversity net gain, but I think we're losing quite a lot of nuance by not recognizing the species level effects that can be given with biodiversity. So yeah, that probably doesn't answer your question very satisfactorily, but it's a good question. There's lots going on when we select trees for any landscape, and biodiversity is just one of those. I think I'll stop there, but thanks, Tracy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, for your question. Gavin, Robbie made a statement earlier, and I know Gavin asked a question earlier, but when you were discussing native and non-native, and Gavin, I wondered if you had a question around this statement that you made in the chat. If not, I wonder if we can ask a question around that. So Gavin, would you like to put your camera and mic on? Right. Well, Gavin was basically saying that the question of native and non-native is a very important one, and it seems difficult at the moment to persuade people that anything other than a native tree will be suitable, even as the climate changes. And yeah, I was curious as to what sort of methods of persuasion, how can we address that issue that Gavin highlights there?
Yeah, it's a really important one. You'll notice one of the criteria is around nativeness and phylogenetic relatedness to native species, because there's no doubt that coevolution between trees and biota is really important. But what we wanted to try and do is to make this metric as agnostic to region as possible, in the sense that we were looking for things that, like floral resource or fruiting resource or other microhabitats that could add value to wildlife. And in terms of persuading people around native and non-native, I think you've only got to look at some of the analysis, for example, that we've just completed for London that I just flagged up at the end there, to see that actually towards the end of this century, there will be some parts of the UK, and we've done this deep analysis on London's trees, where many native species are going to be unsuitable according to the analysis that we do now. And so it's really important to recognize that actually we don't want to be locked into a native only approach to the detriment of future biodiversity value, because they're going to be under stress to such an extent. I do think, though, I will say this is a very different conversation within the urban realm than you might want to have within broader rural woodlands and trees outside of the urban realm, where I think you've got to be much more cautious. But within the urban realm, I really believe that we want a diverse and wide range of palette of trees. And there's so much evidence that non-native species can add an awful lot to the ecological value of the site by, for example, flowering later than our native species might do. So adding that floral resource later in the season. There can be fruiting resources that are quite good, that they're just their climate resilience and their stature might be important. That's not to say that we shouldn't be very cautious around things like invasiveness. Absolutely, we should. But I do think we want an evidence-based approach. And unfortunately, there are some camps that I think take the absence of evidence and equate it to evidence. And actually, often it's that we just don't have the same quality of evidence for biodiversity value of non-native species as we do to those very well-studied native species. So I'm just trying to be as dispassionate as possible. I recognize absolutely that nativeness is critical to biodiversity. But that's not to say that it should be the only factor.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Andy. We'll go a little bit over time just to allow Lee Haycoop to come in. She's got a camera on and mic up to ask her question.
Thanks. And Andy, it was a great talk. Thank you so much. Do you think it's about time we unmoored ourselves from the categorization of A, B, C, and U in terms of valuing trees?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. Yes, it probably is. I think we need a better system to move to if we're going to take that out, and I think that's quite a well embedded system. But I suppose the challenge is lots of things that would achieve low on that score could offer quite a lot from a biodiversity point of view, and I don't know whether that's where you're sort of coming from.
I'm coming from the point of knowing. I work at Homes England, where a developer or highways have said, "Oh, we've got to fell this 400-year-old oak tree for visibility displays," and it doesn't get a valuation any higher than another tree of the same size, even though biodiversity-wise, it's more like a town than a cluster of houses.
Yeah. I mean, I think this speaks to the point where we need species level nuances in our planning decisions, and that we can't just look at tree size, for example, without also looking at tree size and species when we're thinking about whether to preserve or to remove a tree on a development site. And so that's a sort of similar theme around in the biodiversity net gain categorizations as just getting that nuance is important. But unless there's a database and a consensus view on how to measure biodiversity value, then you can't ask practitioners and professionals to add that nuance into it, because it's going to be very judgment led. So perhaps that's something that could be built on off the back of this work, is saying, could we look at tree A, B, C, U category, but also think about biodiversity value of that tree going forward in the context of residual risk and all those other things, and actually get some nuance into these decisions, because they are complicated decisions. But I suggest we're probably a little way off wholesale change. But yeah, very good question. Thanks.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Lee, for your question. So we'll move on now to Neil Beamsley, Group Head of Biodiversity at Bellway Homes, who will explore the questions: has BNG increased development value? Is BNG good for development? Over to you, Neil.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Just to make sure that's come up as presenter mode for everyone.
Yep, that's all good. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Neil Beamsley. I'm Head of Nature and Biodiversity for Bellway Homes. A little bit about myself. I've been with Bellway for around 3 years now. I'm the first person to hold this role, and this role has basically come around because of Biodiversity Net Gain. And the business realised that there's a real need to have an in-house expertise when it comes to how we deliver this going forwards on our development sites. Within the BNG space, I guess I also wear several hats. I do a lot of work with Future Homes Hub. I'm the chair of their good practice group for BNG. I'm also on the editorial board for BS4 2020 update, which is now going to include BNG. So It's a very busy space, but hopefully this afternoon I can give you a little bit of an update in terms of where we are at Bellway and how we're dealing with the requirement to deliver BNG, particularly around trees on our sites. Oops, come on. Okay, so a little bit of sort of background, I guess, from a developer's perspective about how we view BNG. I think fundamentally, to pick up on the point that Nick made earlier, it's a legal requirement. And that's really, really important. I think if BNG had been brought forward as another policy, which is open to interpretation and lots of other factors, I don't think it has the potential, it would have had the potential to be as effective as it does. So from our perspective, it really sharpens the pencil, the fact that this is now a legal requirement and it's something we have to do something about. I think that the second thing for me that equally is really, really important is it's measurable. And what I would say is that from Bellway's perspective, we actually really like BNG. We've been very open about the fact we think it's a good thing. And part of that is it's a leveler. Because everyone is using the same metric, everyone's using the same rule book essentially in terms of how we deliver BNG, what that does is bring consistency. So particularly from a planning perspective, we can have much more confidence that the solution we present to the local planning authority as part of biodiversity gains it is consistent, and therefore the local authority should have a much more even playing field for us in terms of how they view our applications going forward. That's really important. Equally, because it's 30 years, again, it really focuses the mind in terms of how we go about delivering it. Is it deliverable? And it's not just about a number and a spreadsheet, it's about something that can physically exist on the ground, and that's super important. Oops. Because it's legal, it's a high planning priority, and therefore, I mean, I certainly used to be an ecological consultant, and I was certainly privy to meetings in the past where ecology, biodiversity was the afterthought at the end of the meeting. That's no longer the case, and because it's a legal requirement, biodiversity, ecology, whatever you want to call it, now sits at the very top of the tree in terms of priorities. And that's a great privilege, actually, from a consultant point of view, particularly, is that you now are going to be listened to because this is a really important thing. With that comes responsibility, and I think that responsibility is still hitting home in some elements or some levels, but it is important and it's got to be really factored in from the get-go. For those of you who are not quite familiar with BNG, essentially BNG revolves around what is a fancy Excel spreadsheet. You input what you have now, you input what you think you're going to have in terms of habitats at the end of 30 years. You can compare the two and that gives you a number, and the magic number is 10% plus. So anything below 10% is not compliant, anything above that, is. And that simplicity of the very kind of base level of BNG is really quite important to a success, I think. From our perspective as a developer, the key thing is it's a pre-commencement condition. So from my perspective in Bellway, I try and encourage all of my local teams to really have a good go at BNG, even before we've submitted to planning, because that gives us confidence around costs, it gives us confidence around deliverability, it gives us confidence that there won't be any last minute hiccups in terms of getting over the line from a planning application. What it does mean, however, is that we also have to be prepared before we can put a spade in the ground to discharge that BNG condition. And that BNG condition is applied to all applications that are compliant or aren't exempt from BNG at that stage. So there's been a little bit of reordering had to be done. There's a little bit of change of approach in terms of how this is factored into the planning timeline, but actually it works really well from our perspective. It requires us to follow a hierarchy, and that's very much around retaining, enhancing, mitigating, and then if you can't get to 10% at that stage, it's about compensating. That's really logical. It's really well ingrained in the planning process. It's something that everyone understands, and I'm really glad that that's been retained as part of the BNG process because it gives it a kind of continuity in terms of what's gone on before, but also brings that standardization factor that was perhaps missing in the past. BNG, as we know, only considers habitats, and this is one of the things I have to explain to colleagues internally time and time again, that it only considers habitats. We can't offset BNG with bat boxes, bird boxes, insect towers, and things like that. That's understandable. It is a proxy for biodiversity, and without habitats, you don't get the species. So it's logical, but it does also make BNG a bit more of a hard sell because from a customer point of view and a general public point of view, habitats aren't really sexy. Whereas a species, a red squirrel, a red kite, that kind of thing, that's something that people can relate to and look to. So there is a harder task in terms of getting this messaging and the importance of BNG across to customers. But ultimately, I think what we're finding is once you've explained that in a much more succinct way, people do understand, they do get what we're trying to achieve with this new legal requirements. There's also huge practical elements of BNG from a housing developer's perspective, and that's the MANCO managing agent agreement. So generally speaking, once a developer has built out a site, the site will be handed over to a MANCO or a resident management company, and they employ a managing agent who does the physical management of the landscaping. That's super important because we have to remember that those folks who are doing that management are not specialists. They're not, they don't usually work on nature reserves. They manage very functional recreational habitats. Now, there's an importance in there in terms of those folks upskilling, and that is starting to happen. But also we have to be responsible in terms of what we submit to planning to make sure that what we're saying we can do on site is actually deliverable and it's not too onerous. And ultimately, all of the management plans, etc., that sit around BNG that inform how it is going to be delivered on the ground have to speak the language of the person who actually is going to do that management. If you're giving them too much to do, there's too much complexity, and you haven't involved them early enough in the process, they are unfortunately at this stage going to struggle to deliver anything. So a huge part of what I do for Bellway is to sense check every single metric that comes in from our local divisions. I have to sign that off because I have to be comfortable that metric is actually deliverable. And that means it's not going to be too onerous, but it is actually going to deliver what we need for BNG. It's a very fine balance at the moment. And therefore, ultimately, from our perspective as a developer, our customers are really key to making sure BNG works. And that means that they're bought in from the stage at which they approach us to start thinking about buying a house. We're talking to them at that stage about what BNG is, what the constraints are, what it means that their house will look at, the habitats around their house will look like, and how that will affect them going forwards. If they're not bought in, it makes BNG management much more difficult. And that's a really important part of the potential success in the future of BNG and how that will be managed. This is you've probably seen this before, but I like to share this. I think is a really useful visual representation of the change that's happened, certainly in my professional lifetime over the last 20 or so years. There's no denying that developing a site for housing or any other development type will change and generally reduce the biodiversity value of an area. And that's just the nature of what we do. The level of effect, the kind of consistency brings us to that position of net gain. It's not just about consolidation, it's about making things measurably better. And that's a really important nuance for us. I think the key to BNG in some respects is making it as simple as possible. It is a very simple process in some respects, but there's a lot of detail that sits behind it. But if you can get the message over on the simple end of the spectrum, it's easy to then start filling in the details we found. So in terms of our site design, we've done a number of things internally, particularly around training, around processes, around contractual arrangements and things like that to make sure that BNG sits right at the very beginning of any process. If you don't engage early with it, it's incredibly difficult to retrospectively fit into a development scheme. So that's the firm message from me to all my local divisions is you've got to engage with this early, and that's very much happening. First thing we have to do is constraint map. We have to know what we've got now. So the baseline element of BNG is 50% of the puzzle, really. And therefore, you've got to look at your red line boundary. You've got to understand what habitats you already have. You've got to understand their value. You've got to start looking about what needs to be retained, what can be enhanced, what can be mitigated. If you don't do that, then you are tripping yourself up, really, in terms of how BNG works. And you're potentially missing a trick in terms of the outcome of the metric as well. So it's incredibly important to go through that high-level constraints mapping process, which is generally done by our ecological consultants in the first instance. We also have to think about contracts. There's various things we have to do with the landowners that we're buying land from to develop, things like the anti-trashing clauses, for example, to make sure they don't clear sites, because that's really detrimental in terms of how we deliver BNG. But also the key really is retain, and to pick up the theme of today in terms of trees. Trees are something that we always look now to retain. I'll go on to the reasons for that shortly, but if we can retain something realistically and feasibly, then we now do that, because from a BNG metric perspective, that's what we need to do. There's also a very significant change in terms of how the design works. So it's now very much ecology-led. To pick up on the point that was made earlier, we can't retrospectively shoehorn this in. We've got to build around rather than build from biodiversity and ecology. But we also have to be realistic. I think this is really important. There's a lot of discussion in the media and on social media and things about development, and it almost feels sometimes like development is here to fix biodiversity, which I think is a little bit misguided. From our perspective, we have to make sure we leave that natural environment in a better state. That's just the fundamental of where we are now. But also we have to remember that that space that we're creating is also primarily for our communities that we build as part of a housing scheme. They need recreational space, they need play areas, they need allotments, they need lots of other things. So there's lots of constraints on that landscaping area around, as well as having to deliver that measurable gain for biodiversity. So I always say to all my divisions, it's better to deliver a hybrid solution well than on-site badly. There's no point trying to shoehorn things onto site which just aren't going to fit. And actually, if you've got the opportunity to go off-site with BNG, sometimes that's the best solution to finding the right solution for biodiversity and commercially and all the other factors that go into it. From our perspective, we have our corporate biodiversity partners are Plant Life, the charity Plant Life. And one of the things they've done is to produce our BNG design code. Now, this is a document that goes to all of our local divisions and ultimately ends up with the consultant ecologists and the landscapers, and it gives them a framework in terms of how we want to deliver biodiversity on site. It's not just about shoehorning things in, it's about thinking practically about how that landscape functions, how it's managed, and how it interacts with the people and animals and species that live in that area. It's not an absolute Bible, but it is something we're working towards. Ultimately, what we want is a Bellway, I guess you'd call it a corporate identity when it comes to delivering biodiversity net gain. And as I've said before, equally, we've got to make sure the mancos and the managing agents are involved with this. There's no point giving them a solution they can't deliver. So what we're trying to do is bring their engagement much further forward in the process than we have in the past to make sure that they're comfortable with what we're proposing and they can actually physically deliver what we're saying we can. In terms of trees, I guess from our perspective, there's several key considerations in terms of how we interact with trees on our sites. I think one of the things that's often overlooked is it's, house builders. We're not really house builders, we're house sellers. We build houses to sell. And that's a key, that's the key business that we have in terms of how we derive our income. And it's not insignificant to note that actually the houses that sell first are generally the ones that overlook green space. And that just lends itself to the fact that I think what most people on the call know is that people want to be near green space. People understand the inherent value of being around green areas. So that's not something we've measured scientifically, but certainly anecdotally, when you speak to the sales directors and the sales teams, it's always the green space areas that sell best first. There is a constraint with that in as much as very, very few people are able to buy a house without a mortgage. And at the moment, the mortgage companies don't necessarily attribute an additional value to that. So from a monetary point of view, it's just another house to them. They're not really that bothered whether it's overlooking green space. That is starting to change. And certainly we are having conversations with some bigger mortgage advisors about added value, essentially, in terms of accessing people to green space. But it is definitely a consideration. In terms of the management of trees and woodlands on site, certainly it's true when you're developing a new site with new tree planting, the upfront cost is high, but then in the long term management is much less. So there's a kind of payoff and a balance there in terms of what we're doing. There's also a consideration around retention of trees. So sometimes a tree may be dangerous. We've got some very, very good ARB consultants who work with this. They're really starting to get the balance we need between a site being safe and the liability that comes with not being safe versus what we have to deliver from a biodiversity net gain perspective, and the balance and payoff between the two. You've also got the aesthetic. Trees are something that a lot of people can really engage with, and that's really, really important because you want to develop a site which people enjoy living at. They want to go out in the front door in the morning and be in a nice environment, and that's a really important part of what we do. But equally, it's the ecology value as well. So lots of different strands of trees that need to pull together to bring together something that can actually work for all the people who are then living in that space. Certainly in terms of benefits, the trees very much frame the landscaping that we develop. So, if you've got mature existing features, then use them. Don't chop them down. They're They're absolute assets in terms of what we do. I think that there's a critical mindset shift that needs to happen really in terms of nature being critical infrastructure. And it's no different to a highways network. It's no different to a SUD system or anything like that. It is critical infrastructure. And part of that is really trying to retain what you've got in situ and manage it if you need to appropriately. It's great. You know, the tree space is great because it's instant well-being. You know, we all understand the value and the societal need really of well-being spaces, and trees are absolutely fundamental to that. But also people get very, very impassioned very quickly about trees, which is brilliant because it shows they have ownership and they care for their environment they're in. There's obviously the biodiversity element to it, you know, the bats, the birds, the insects, everything that lives in those individual trees, that's absolutely fundamental. It's a big part of the picture. But also there's that fundamental link to the past as well, in terms of a tree is a very long-lived being. It's seen a lot of history. And I think if you just adopt an approach perhaps that's been in there in the past, where you just cut down a tree because it's inconvenient, well, then you're losing a lot of really important things that can't be replaced very, very quickly. So that's a key part of the benefit as well. So just to pick up on that previous point I made about the cultural biodiversity and sort of social value of a tree, this is an actual tree on one of our sites. Obviously it's an actual tree, but it's a tree on one of our actual sites. Very straggly old ash. It's had quite a hard life by the look of it. It's dropped some limbs at some stage. The bottom crown is starting to fail. But actually it's probably about 125, 150 years old, maybe something like that. And it got me thinking that, well, actually, if you think about what that tree's seen in its lifetime, it's really quite spectacular. So if you think when Alexander Graham Bell was developing his telephone, that tree was a sapling. Very small, new to the world, unsure of its future going forwards, but actually there's some amazing things going on elsewhere in the world. As a semi-mature tree, it saw the first flight, which in itself was quite an achievement from a human point of view. Getting towards maturity, victory in Europe. Huge thing. It survived the war and it's still kicking. And then as it's getting to the stage where it's starting to get a bit leggy, you've got the Berlin Wall coming down, and all the social history comes around that, and all of that human context and all that human construct has been witnessed by that one tree that actually could easily just be felled if we're not careful. So it's really important to give that wider understanding and view of how trees function in the landscape and how they function with humanity. And I guess equally, you think about how many wood pigeons, for example, could have been raised in that one tree. If you think about a wood pigeon has what, 2 squabs a year, twice a year, 200, 300, 400 chicks maybe have been raised in that one tree, and all the other biodiversity that comes with it. So my rambling point is that there's a lot more to a tree than just a tree. I think it's got a huge wider value, and we have to make sure that the biodiversity net gain process embraces that, as well as just being focused in a kind of silo way around the biodiversity messaging. Finally, just a few things in terms of what we're doing as Bellway. So we have looked at tiny forests. Some of you will be familiar with tiny forests already. The principle being that you plant a lot of trees in a small space and they grow very quickly and very tall to fill in gaps. We have done a few of these, but from our perspective, they're not as efficient really in terms of what we need to deliver for biodiversity net gain. So we've still got a few, but we're stepping away from those really in terms of how we deliver our tree space on site. We've also looked at what quite a few developers have looked at in terms of the tree per plot. The idea is that you give every new householder a tree, which I guess on one level you look at and think, well, if you've got 500 new houses, that's 500 new trees, brilliant. But the problem with that is that once you hand over those keys, it's up to the individual landowner and house owner in terms of what they do with it. So they can cut it down, they can poorly manage it, they can leave it, and therefore you've not really got a big return on what the investment is and actually the benefit from a biodiversity and treescape perspective. So what we're doing instead is community woodland. So what we're proposing to do between now and 2030 is create, where the space allows, a new woodland in each site, and each woodland will essentially be populated with the equivalent of 1 tree per plot. The benefit of that is that it's managed by the Manco, so there's no ongoing requirement for the individual householder to manage the trees, but equally it allows the community to start essentially generating a sense of ownership around that community woodland. We're also looking at climate resilience. I think to pick up on the point previously about native, non-native climate change, that's a big factor. If we don't plant BNG space that's not resilient to climate change, then we might be in a situation where it's failing, and that's not ideal in terms of delivery against that 10% target. And that goes hand in hand with soil management and what we put the trees in. They've got to grow in something, and therefore we need to make sure that what they're growing in is suitable. And this is all under our Better with Bellway strategy, which has got a thing called BNG Plus. So what we're doing is to take out things like climate change, might have a situation where habitats don't take in the way you want them to. It's better to over-deliver on BNG than under-deliver on BNG. So what we're proposing to do is for every site from September last year, we're over-delivering on the 10% requirement. Anything north of that is compliant with our BNG Plus. And ultimately, and finally, I think from my perspective and our perspective, trees are absolute win-win. From a development point of view, they carry more than just a tree, and therefore we're going to continue to try and safeguard them and protect them as best we can within our developments. And I think I've run out of time.
Yep, we've just got there. Thanks, Neil. We went a bit over anyway earlier on, so you're spot on. Thanks very much. And I particularly loved the old ash tree. That was great. We've got some quick questions to ask you, and then we'll go to the whole panel. Ben Grieg, are you able to put your camera on and ask your question to Neil?
Absolutely, Tracy. Yeah, thanks so much, Neil. That's really fascinating. I'll be quick, so there's so many people here. Really, it all sounds fantastic, but I'm just extremely interested in how, especially over a 30-year period, if we're talking about the net gain being amortized or, delivered ultimately at the end of that, how it's going to be enforced, what penalties exist for non-compliance or failure to comply. I live in Cambridge, where we're going to have a huge amount of development over the next 10, 20 years. We've already had the A14 littered with dead trees, thousands and thousands of dead trees. And so it's extremely important that these things aren't just set in motion and then left to fail. Not in your case, I don't think, but perhaps in others, So could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think from our perspective, long before we get to enforcement, it's about making sure we set the wheels in motion in the right direction. So a lot of what we're doing at the moment, as I mentioned before, about making sure that metrics are actually deliverable in the first place. It's about contracts. It's about making sure that when the Manco takes over, they understand what they're taking over. But also BNG has a fairly sort of rigorous monitoring regime that goes with it as well. And that's got to be something that's not just a ticky box exercise. It's something that's got some teeth. So that all relates to the Section 106 agreements that are signed for the site. And from our perspective, it's really just trying to make sure we set everything in motion as robustly as we can to then in the future have the greatest chance of success. There is an unknown, and I accept that. But from our perspective, it's what's within our control and what can we do to make sure it does work going forwards in the way we intend it to.
So will it be policed by Natural England or?
No, it's the local planning authority. So because it's a Section 106, it's the local planning authority that do the actual policing. But there's a mechanism in every contract and every legal agreement to make sure monitoring happens and corrective action if need be.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Mark Syrett, you've got your camera on there. Are you ready to ask your question of Neil?
Neil, thank you very much. Given the change to the national SUD standards, how are you using those to try and integrate more BNG into the process? I'll give you the context. I work for an LFFA, and in essence, we're not seeing very much coming through.
No, with restraint, I think is my response to that. It's often when we get metrics in from consultants, they've thought as SUDs is a really obvious win, but we also need to remember that SUDs are an engineering feature and they're also a kind of actively managed engineering feature. And that's going to be a limiting factor to a point in terms of what you can achieve from a biodiversity net gain perspective. So we're trying to push what we can do, wet basins, wet resilient seed mixes and things like that. But it's also, you've got to be a bit careful about how much emphasis you place on that from a biodiversity gain perspective. So again, it goes back to that balance point I was making about it's not just about creating nature reserves, it's about creating a functional habitat and a functional space, really.
There's a couple of tricks that I've seen which might be of some value, and that is creating effectively the boundary with structural soils and planting a hedge into it. So you can use that as where the topography is correct, you can use that to add quite a chunk of hedge and also some exceedance event material, and also attenuating tree pits. Not seen one and it's screaming out for a multitude of those, I think.
Yeah, I think that as much as BNG is a leveler, I think you've still got to take every site on its own individual merits. And I think that the more we get used to using the regime, the more we can start to look at good practice and share that good practice and make sure everyone's understanding about what's going on over the fence, because that's a really important part of it. I think if someone's had a good idea, then blimey, just share it, because it's in everyone's benefit to do so.
That's great. Thanks, Neil, for the answer, and Mark for your question. Chris Baines, was your question for Neil or for the whole panel?
Yeah.
Okay, crack on.
Neil, great presentation and great to see that you're in post, I must say. About 20 years ago, I chaired the design panel for Barking Riverside for Bellways. And I just wonder, and it would have been wonderful to have had you in post then, I have to say, but I just wonder whether, as part of the process, Bellway has been going back to look at earlier projects and what went right and what went wrong, because that scheme was huge, 10,000 homes, very much dependent on large areas of reed bed and wetland, which proved in the early days to be completely unmanageable by the developer. And I think really important to kind of see whether there are lessons that Bellway themselves have actually taken on board in the work that they're doing now.
Not with the structure that I'd like, but I think what has happened is that the way we develop housing schemes over the years has kind of evolved quite organically anyway, and it's learned lessons from previous schemes. Now, one of the big things we've had to do with BNG coming in is to kind of stop that process and have a bit of a reflection on terms of what's the direction of travel and is that consistent with BNG. And a lot of the things that we're now trying to do, to go back to the Plant Life Design Code, for example, have kind of taken those messages and looked at how we kind of soften the edges off a little bit and integrate that into the BNG world. So there's a lot of knowledge in the company which has been here for a long time, but equally we're also having to learn a new regime, and those two have taken a bit of integration, shall we say, in terms of how that works. But we're certainly getting there in terms of that general level of understanding and what we have to do going forwards.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks again, Neil. Thanks for your presentation. So we're going to open up now. If all the speakers could put their cameras back on. So Andy, if you can put your camera on too. And we're going to open up to some questions now to everybody. I know Marie-Claire had a question that I thought would be good for Nick and Neil maybe to ask. Marie-Claire, are you able to put your camera on for us? And then perhaps Sue, if you could look at who might like to pop up next.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can see and hear you. Thanks, Mary.
Great. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask this because I'm very new to BNG, but my understanding is that local authorities are struggling to enforce the net gain locally, and quite often the developers, when they have to buy units, they'll be doing that outside of the urban environment and in cities. So I work for a street tree planting charity, and we're in a position to help facilitate planting and plant the trees with highways and with green scene departments, but we're not sure how to access and support this and prevent the units from being sold further away. So that was my question, really.
Nick, do you want to start that one off?
Yeah, no, and it's a really good question, Marie-Claire. So there are incentives if anywhere, any geography, including urban areas, if a developer can't achieve the gain on site. And in urban areas, actually, they tend to do it more on site than perhaps sometimes in non-urban areas. But there are incentives to deliver locally, and politically, it's councillors are often very, very keen to have gains delivered within that particular authority as well. The challenge comes, though, is that clearly there needs to be sites available locally in order to do that. And as we know, urban areas have typically kind of less areas of kind of green space available to them than the non-urban. And where they are available, they've often got kind of multiple uses as well. So it can be more challenging to bring forward urban sites. But it is something we're keen to see happen. I know it is happening. So some authorities already kind of set that kind of process up where they're looking to provide local kind of off-site opportunities, albeit still within an urban context. specifically on street trees, that's of particular interest to many planning authorities as well. It's often individual trees that are required by developers. It's something that we're hoping to work with the Forestry Commission on a kind of case study, good practice, using some examples as well. So feel free to drop me a line afterwards as well. If you've got examples of things you're working on, we'd be very interested in finding out as well. And hopefully the organisers can put my details out, or I can put it in the chat, or I'm on LinkedIn as well. So
that would be fantastic. Thanks, Nick. I'll follow up with you after this. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Neil, have you got anything further to add to
that? I guess just a note of practicality, in as much as the offsite market is still very much developing. It's much better than it was 18 months ago, but it's still not fully developed yet. So therefore you still do have hotspots of availability and hot and cold spots, I suppose you'd call it, in terms of lack of availability. So from our perspective, we'd always like to generally go closer to development if we can, but sometimes we're actually limited by what's available, both in terms of physically available, but also from a price perspective in terms of what's commercially available as well.
Okay, great.
Could I just ask a little bit to do with this? Nick, we all talk about the importance of connectivity and connecting green infrastructure and so on. And I just wondered if there's any mechanism for controlling where habitat banks or off-site opportunities are, with the need to make sure that they're connected, or is it just a wild west out there?
It's a bit of both, and I'll explain why. So firstly, the good news is there absolutely is an incentive built into BNG to be delivering in areas identified within local nature recovery strategies. So we've talked about the metric a few times, and it includes a multiplier that provides a positive incentive to do that. And clearly, as more local nature recovery strategies are rolling out across the country as well, they're really useful kind of strategies to look into. And landowners are beginning to recognise the value to them as well, that actually if they're within an LNRS area and they're providing habitats identified in the LNRS, again, that will give them an uplift. But at the end of the day, it does depend on the landowners being willing and able and ready to do this as well. So in the early days of BNG, it was much more a case of, well, who's willing to take a risk? But it was a risk at that point. This is a new thing people getting to grips with. So there was a bit more of a scattergun in terms of where these sites were coming forward. I think there is now landowners beginning to recognise that actually there is a spatial relationship to the LNRS that's important, and it is incentivising people coming forward in some of those areas, although it remains still a commercial decision by them, and they may obviously choose to do other things. But yeah, so it's not perfect, but it is providing an incentive.
Great, thanks, Nick. Sue, did you see, was there somebody that might like to ask a question, or anybody in our audience want to put a hand up?
Yes, there was, oh goodness, Tanya White, you had a question about permitted development and BNG, if you're there.
Oh, hi, thank you. I think I was just pointing to that since BNG has come in, I've been in the game for 20 plus years. It may be a coincidence of my work, but I believe I've seen a massive uptick in PD schemes coming forward, and the sectioning off of programmes and plans into PD and necessary planning permission in a more aggressive way. I just wondered if at national level, because it appears untracked to me, through utilities and, energy network growing and such, that as public bodies, that public bodies are implementing such plans and policies. I just wonder if there's any aggregation of PD works and losses under those accounting on the balance sheet for what is in fact recovery towards the environmental improvement plan at national level and what is loss. So I guess that came forward at the time when Nick was speaking, but it's, I think, worth thinking about in terms of, any works that are coming forward under PD and how we protect heritage setting and material considerations when they're not brought forward because there's an ambiguity around PD versus planning in other respects. So it's more of a point really than a question. I'll bow out now.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. I don't know if Nick, you're able to kick that one off.
I mean, so BNG doesn't cover permitted developments, obviously, because it doesn't require planning permission. I'm not aware of any stats looking at has there been an increased use of PDs or not. I know the planning portal captures a lot of stats relating to BNG and the kind of exemptions routes that people are going through for that. That's been fairly constant and static now since May, but it hasn't sort of disaggregated permitted developments because it wouldn't know about them. So it would be interesting to know if this is something that others have come across as well, or whether your experience is just a kind of one instance of that. I can certainly bring back to the planning advisory service as well, just to get a sense check from other planning officers, because they've got a network across all planning authorities in England as well. It'd be an interesting one just to know whether that is actually the case. All I would say though is that although mandatory BNG obviously doesn't cover permitted developments, there are many schemes that go through as permitted developments that are doing BNG as well. So there are, it's certainly possible for schemes still to do it, even though they don't have to do it if they're a permitted development.
Neil and Andrew, have you come across that at all?
No, I mean, we generally don't engage that regularly with permitted development. Most of our stuff is consented, so it's not really something we look at.
No, this is not my world.
Yeah.
So yeah, carry on.
Okay. I think it looks like Chris has got a question. Would that be right? And then afterwards, there's Ruth Elwood has asked a question. I wonder, Ruth, if you wouldn't mind putting your camera on, asking your question after Chris.
It's following on from that last point, actually. I chair a stakeholder advisory group for the National Grid, and the regulator, Ofgem, has just refused to accept their proposition that they want BNG and nature recovery to be delivered across everything that they do. There's an obligation for them to deliver that where planning consent is needed, but where deemed planning consent already exists, then the regulator has said, no, we're not actually going to sanction spending on BNG there. And that's all the bits, all the long lines between the major infrastructure construction projects. So although in terms of expenditure, it's a relatively small part of the £60 billion they're spending, in terms of landscape impact, that's a huge gap. And one of the things that will help to plug the gap is if the nationally significant infrastructure projects do get Biodiversity Net Gain. That was supposed to be approved in November. It's now been delayed until May. If that actually goes through, then that would mean that BNG would apply, for instance, to the 180 kilometres of new line through Essex and Suffolk and Norfolk, which is very contentious at the moment. And I just wondered whether there is security about the NSIPs actually getting BNG, or whether there is a danger that having shifted it from November to May, it could get kicked into the long grass altogether, because it would be hugely significant, not just for the energy transmission network, but for all the other NSIP programs and projects in rail and road and all the other infrastructure, major infrastructure impacts on the landscape.
So specifically on that one, hopefully to kind of reassure in this respect, Chris. So the reason why it was pushed back from November to May was the government it needed still to consult further on the details of how in practice it would be applied to NSIP regimes. And that consultation kind of got delayed itself in terms of being able to get out through government, partly just because of the election and the kind of changes in ministers, etc. So it wouldn't have given people anything like enough time to get ready for the new regime in order for November to still remain feasible. The government has now done that completed that consultation. It should be publishing its results very imminently, hopefully before Christmas. And government ministers on record as saying yes, it will be May. So hopefully it will definitely be May. But as you said, it will be a real positive thing. I mean, I should stress it will apply to development going new applicants to the DCO process from that point onwards. Many NSIPs currently do BNG on a voluntary basis.
15 minutes.
But
That was me being asked when I was going to make. I was being asked when am I going to make a cup of tea?
I think you've got a thumbs up from everybody there, Sue.
But yeah, so it should be happening, Chris.
Thanks, Nick.
Great. Bill Blackledge, are you able to put your camera on for the most recent question you've got here about how secure is BNG? Thanks, Bill.
Hi. So it's a fairly simple question. How secure is BNG in the light of the government's growth priority, growth above all, and how might it be likely to change in the future?
So I can't directly speak for government because Natural England is separate to the kind of decision makers in this regard, but the government's been very clear that it is fully supportive of BNG. As we're just talking about, it's expecting to extend it to nationally significant infrastructure projects. It did run a consultation back in the summer looking at changes or potential changes to the application of BNG for minor potential new category of sites called medium and also for brownfield sites. We are still waiting for the outcome of that consultation response. So it's possible that changes will be made, but it's not going away in that regard. The other thing I would say, and the point's been made a couple of times, that BNG is a legal requirement. If government is to make any changes, it will take some time for those actually to come into effect. It may be kind of 8 months, a year before they actually come through, because it would require some changes to legislation and then new guidance, etc. But no, it's not going away. It's an existing thing. It's not been replaced by the NRF either. That's an additional thing. So I hope that kind of reassures in that regard, Bill.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Nick.
Right, thanks, Bill. I'd asked Ruth Elwood if she was able to put a camera on, but I'm not. Ruth, are you there? Are you able to ask your question?
I am indeed, if my
Fantastic
system will work. It was a question for Neil. We do a lot of residential development, but I was wondering how Bellway managed to get around Chapter 4.2 for the NHBC with trees on development land, because basically most of the developers we work with are not very keen on deepening foundations to allow for trees within streets. And whilst it's great that you're planting community woodlands, trees in streets, in my opinion, are actually even more vital. But if you can get the trees in the streets, how do you then get around the adoption from highways authorities and local authorities who then want to charge a fortune for the privilege?
I'll be completely honest with you, Ruth. That's not something that's on my radar in terms of being an issue at the moment. So I've not had wind of that if that is going on. Certainly in terms of the BNG schemes that I've approved recently, they've all got street trees, boulevards, things like that. So
well, I would say that we have to audit a lot of developers' plans, and we're finding that there are a lot of landscape architects out there who have no idea about the NHBC impacts, and they're planting forest scale trees meters away from buildings, which will undermine every plot and every garage on the site. So my answer would be ask all developers to check the credentials of their landscape architects, because NHBC has some very strict rules on distance and offsets from buildings.
Can I jump in here, because I've got some insider knowledge?
I thought you might.
So we're in discussions, the Arbor Association and Trees and Design Action Group are in discussions with NHBC about revising Chapter 4.2, because the distances of permitted, which all links to insurance of, and maybe you've all read the small print and written your own insurance policies, and you wouldn't have a tree anywhere near your house if it's on shrinkable clay in and shallow foundations. But the distances in that Chapter 4.2 are spurious. They're not really properly evidence-based. And so the Arbor Association is looking to revise its guidance on this, and then it will, go around to a review of Chapter 4.2. So something is happening there, but it's very slow. But what's interesting is the MPPF clause 136 requires all new streets to have trees. So already we've got a potential conflict. They've got to have trees, but we've got to get the foundations right. And Neil, you can probably bear me out. I would never want anybody to dig a really deep foundation. I think it's a horrendously dangerous thing to be asking people to do. So, but screw piles and other ways of doing foundations are actually getting cheaper the whole time. And we do have a Trees and Design Action Group. We're working with Gary Wynne with the RIBA on how to better integrate trees and buildings, because we're wanting trees for so many things that are positive for buildings, and yet we've got these sort of other issues that kind of make it difficult. So that's where that's coming to. Things don't move very quickly, but we are trying to move it forward.
Thanks, Sue, for jumping in. And Sue, I was going to ask you, you had a question for Neil, actually. I thought it might be a good time to ask.
Oh, what, the one about even if BNG wasn't mandatory, are you finding that the value of having biodiversity net gain on your sites is actually worth doing, so you would do it anyway for other reasons?
Yeah, and we actually ran a questionnaire poll, whatever you want to call it, with our customers back in April, May time this year. We had nearly 1,000 responses from customers. So we have basically a portal that customers can access once they're on our system in terms of a potential future purchase. And there's lots of ways of interacting with them on that. So we asked them some very simple questions about are you familiar with the term biodiversity, yes or no? And there's a lot of ambiguity around that. I think just to go slightly off piece for a second, I think from my own personal perspective, there is a bit of a PR issue with calling it biodiversity net gain, because a lot of people don't necessarily understand what the term biodiversity means. Nature gain, for example, may be a slightly more accessible term, but that's a slight aside. But we also ask questions around whether you think it's important that developers support local nature. The response was overwhelmingly positive, as you might expect. We asked questions around whether it's important that on-site design is designed with biodiversity and nature in mind. And again, it was an absolutely overwhelmingly positive response to that. So I think what we have to do is help our customers understand. And I think the majority of people have a kind of an inherent interest and a want to do well by the natural world. And I think what we can do as developers and other people in this space as well is to really help people understand what they can do. So a big part of what we're doing with Plant Life, for example, is our native only show home gardens. And the idea of those is to encourage people to come into the show home garden space, see what we've done in terms of native only planting, peat free, encouraging invertebrates, things like that, and then hopefully mirror something similar in their own gardens once they take ownership of their new property. And it's that slow drip effect of that positive messaging and helping people to understand what they can do. The idea being that a small thing makes a big difference if you do it enough times. So yeah, absolutely. I think people want to engage. There's sometimes need a little bit of help getting there in terms of what they can do positively to achieve that.
Can I just jump in there quickly?
Yeah.
I'd be really interested in if you could turn the anecdotal information around the houses selling quicker if they're next to green spaces into actual evidence, because I think that would be really useful piece of the puzzle in terms of the value of green space on new developments and so on, and that would be a great way to capture it, I think. So it sounds like you're halfway there to getting a really useful bit of evidence. Yeah. If you could make that sort of less abstract and more concrete, I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. And to get my tiny violin out, I am basically the resource in Bellway for biodiversity. So whatever I achieve is quite slow burn, but certainly it's on my radar in terms of looking at things like that and seeing how we take that forwards.
Yeah, and any other developers on the call, maybe you could do the same thing. That would be really useful information to have, because it's like you were just saying, it shows where people's priorities are in terms of that sort of green asset.
Tracy, does that link to Tilly Grimes's question?
Yeah.
About,
Sorry, go ahead. And yeah, as you mentioned, I was going to bring in Tilly on this one, actually. Tilly Grimes, are you able to put your camera on for us and ask your question on biodiversity? Whilst Tilly's trying to do that, the other thing I was just going to say is that I know that Nick, you asked for this previously when the early days of setting up the metric. Is case studies are always really important in these circumstances, and here at the LI, that's something that we're going to be updating our end. So I think that's always a really good way of showing the examples of good practice. Sue, if you got hold of Tilly's question, I wonder if
so it was to say that is biodiversity value something that could be applied to planting plans, which kind of fits with that's one for Andy, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, the purpose of doing this, or one of the reasons for doing the sort of species level biodiversity value, is that you can evaluate different planting palettes, not only in future landscapes, but also potentially in landscapes that have already been designed and established. And of course, once we get this sort of theoretical, if you like, framework around whether we think a particular landscape should be giving good or high biodiversity value versus low biodiversity value, there's some really interesting work to sort of truth check that on real sites, on new developments, on older developments and so on, and see whether we can collate evidence that certain palettes of species deliver better biodiversity value than other palettes of species. And as I say, trying to move away from sort of tree area as a single entity, and understanding that structural and functional diversity and species diversity within a planting palette is really also important element of the delivery process. So yeah, I would hope so, but I mean, obviously that's the first step is to get something that we can evaluate against.
Can I just ask quickly, sorry to interrupt, but on the NHBC thing, it raised the whole thing about water up demand of trees and, low water demand and so on. Can you just clarify, do we actually know, do we have proper evidence about water demand, or is that another of the kind of what we think happens, but we can't actually prove it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. And I mean, I have to say, I've done quite a lot of work using SapFlow over the last 5 years around water demand of different tree species, and the allocation of various species to various levels of water demand in the NHBC guidance is gibberish, frankly. I mean, it's just total nonsense. And I don't know how they've come to those species in those categories. But anyway, don't get me started on that one. But yeah, suffice to say, I think it's a space where additional work is needed. And actually, I think people are being sold dummies when it comes to trees being close to buildings. So yeah, I probably sort of need to call a lawyer in at this stage. But yeah, it's more work to be done would be a generous way of saying it. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Andy. In actual fact, there's a lot of activity in the chat as well when we mentioned the case studies and people suggesting places to go and look. So that's really, really useful. Thanks. So I think unless you can see any other questions that if people
I can't see any urgently. If the speakers, if they gave any references like Neil, your guides and so on, if you email them to me, I'll put the references in the chat when I'll save this chat now and try and sort it out and make it in some order that can be more useful for everybody. And then it will go on the website. So if there are any references that I ought to put into that, just email them to me separately and I'll do that when I get onto that little task.
And just if we've got one question just popped up, and I haven't quite read it fully, but Chris Baines, I don't know if you want to quickly ask your question before we finish up and put your hand up. You're on mute. There we go.
Just one specific issue about water uptake and urban trees that I've banged on endlessly, but I think there's a really major issue here in that all the pressure to reduce leakage by water companies is missing a really important point, which is that most of the big trees, in my view, in London and other big cities are pretty dependent on the leakage from water mains. And as we deal with the leakage from water mains, a very major political issue, I think we are putting increasing numbers of those 100-year-old trees at extra stress. And I've seen that particularly working in the Elephant and Castle on the redevelopment of the Haygate estate. Those huge 5-story high London plains were all growing in demolished rubble, basically sitting over London clay, but irrigated by leaking water mains, which of course will be sorted out through the development process. So there's a lack of joined up thinking about urban landscapes generally.
Yeah, very, very good point, Chris. I'd agree with that.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Chris, for making that point. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, is it a good time to sort of wrap up now?
I think so. We've all got to think about that cup of tea. You know, got pressure here.
So yeah, I'd just like to say thanks to our speakers today and Sue for inviting me. It's been fascinating for me, and I'm going to look back on the recording actually as well, and all the bits that I might have missed along the way, and all the extra advice and ideas in the chat too. So I thought that was fantastic as well. Very engaged audience that you've got there, Sue. So yeah, I'll pass over to you, Sue, and thank you everyone for joining.
Well, thank you for chairing so well, and we pretty well stuck to time, which is fantastic. So that was our last seminar for 2025. We're planning our seminars for 2026, and the theme we've fixed on is looking at trees as critical urban infrastructure, which gives a lot of scope to look at social, environmental, and economic infrastructure. We've fixed the date, so they'll be on our website. You can save the date, and we'll try and get the program together as quickly as possible. So I think, you know, there'll be all sorts of things. If anybody wants to take part or has a suggestion, please get in touch with us and let us know. And otherwise, I really think it's just thank you to everybody who's attended. Over 260 people managed to come today, as well as the 500 that had registered. So I think this is a topic that hasn't yet had the last word, but so we'll probably need another review in a year's time to see how things are going. But anyway, thank you all very much, and you can all go and have that cup of tea now. Oh yes, and Chris Lowe, yes, happy Christmas, everybody, or season's greetings, whatever we should say.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.